So, as we said, urban renewal, good or bad? Spoiler alert, it's a bunch of bullshit dressed up as progress. So we're just going to jump right into it. So urban renewal is one of those things that sounds like it was a really good idea, and then people get involved. Now, one of the couple of things that I want to talk about before we really get into it is a couple of vocabulary things. So urban decay, aka urban rot, urban blight, and then urban renewal. So urban renewal is government or private initiatives aimed at addressing issues such as urban decay, upgrading infrastructure, revitalizing city neighborhoods, aka urban regeneration, urban development, urban redevelopment. Now, also urban decay there, that is basically whenever you walk by a neighborhood and you see crumbling buildings, gigantic potholes, streetlights that don't work, lots of vacant storefronts and apartments, that's urban decay, basically. So this concept of urban renewal is aimed at getting rid of all of those ugly bits and trying to make them pretty, and it rarely goes well. So urban decay can happen for a variety of reasons, mostly a combination of any of the following. So we have industrialization or deindustrialization. So anytime that there is a factory that springs up suddenly and disrupts the entire area, that can cause some urban decay because people are like, what the fuck is this in my neighborhood, and I want to leave. Then deindustrialization is whenever a keystone business or businesses leave the area for whatever reason, and suddenly there's an economic collapse in that neighborhood. That can also cause urban decay. Extreme population fluctuations, which can be caused by industrial or deindustrialization. Counter-urbanization, also known as white flight. So when people who have money and assets leave a neighborhood for a variety of reasons. Usually it's because the vibe of the neighborhood has changed. And in a lot of neighborhoods, it meant that people who were not white moved in. We also have disinvestment and disenfranchisement and economic restructuring. So what this means is your city has deemed that your neighborhood is garbage and they don't feel like maintaining the garbage. So that's why you get neighborhoods that definitely need help. And I'm looking at those big potholes. I'm looking at a ton of graffiti that's not actually street art. I'm looking at, vacant buildings because lenders can't let those spaces, things like that. And then the city and other private investors will look at that neighborhood and go, yeah, doesn't seem like my jive. Thank you. I was pregnant last year. I couldn't enjoy this last year. Vodka's nice. Anyway. So yeah, and then being deprioritized by the city, meaning that you don't get the same opportunities as, some of the other neighborhoods around you. Maybe you have more police presence, but it's not helpful. Maybe street cleaning and garbage pickup doesn't happen as often in your neighborhood, things like that. We also have declining property values and infrastructure decline, which also stems from all of these, disinvestment, deprioritization. We also then have high rates of unemployment and poverty because when keystone employers and mom and pop shops move away, there's less opportunities in your neighborhood, meaning that people either need to leave or they need to try to find a way to scrounge out a living in their neighborhood. You also have high rates of crime and a loss of community. Again, these are all very intertwined. It's never just one thing that causes urban decay. Put simply, urban renewal means to clear the blighted, unsightly parts of a city or neighborhood and create new housing and economic opportunities, as well as community assets such as schools, libraries, and parks. Which sounds good, right? Wrong! The reason is that more often than not, racism fucks it up for everyone. And that's been the case for literally everything, whether that be access to socialized medicine, access to adequate public education, adequate roads and streetlights and things like that, well-funded public libraries. Racism fits itself into every single little thing, and in this case, it's in urban development. Now, One of the things that this does, the consequences of urban development, is that it displaces communities and marginalized communities, including immigrants, us queers, the elderly and disabled, indigenous peoples, and the most historically impacted people of color. So, literally, just anybody who's not white. These are the groups that are most commonly impacted by urban revitalization or urban development. And the reason is because we're just undervalued. We feel, or not we feel, cities and people who develop in certain neighborhoods feel like we are not going to bring in a adequate economic return. So these neighborhoods get deprioritized. This then drives up the cost of living because if you have no good economic opportunities, and then suddenly, like, let's say a private developer comes in, buys up the big warehouse and builds luxury condos, which happens in a lot of neighborhoods, that's gonna boom, your rent's gonna skyrocket, your property values are gonna go up, but there's nothing to back it all up for the people who already live there. It also removes a lot of the unique charm and flavor of vibrant communities, and this is what we also call gentrification. So you guys, if you've lived here for more than 5 minutes, you can probably name a neighborhood that's been overly gentrified. Go ahead, shout it out. Exactly. Exactly. So it's been a big problem. And there's many reasons also for gentrification and how and why it happens, but we'll get into it. But this kind of thing kind of dates all the way back to the City Beautiful movement. Now, in the United States, this was focusing on creating beautiful and functional public spaces that would promote good morals, civic pride, and very white middle-class behavior. It was also meant to sanitize the unappealing and distasteful parts of urban life, such as homeless people, the impoverished, and slums. So basically, the City Beautiful movement, which there's a lot of aspects that I really like about the City Beautiful movement, and our city's kind of built around those aspects, but it doesn't actually address a lot of problems that were already existing in these cities. It's kind of like slapping a white coat of paint on a crumbling fence, right? Now, the first real, like, large-scale example of this is the World's Fair of 1893. Lots of firsts came out of that fair. So things like the first streetlights happened there, the zipper, Pabst Blue Ribbon, Juicy Fruit, the Ferris wheel. All of these things came from this fair. But the implementation of what we would consider a beautifully designed, intelligently designed, functional city comes from the World's Fair. Things like neatly laid out grid streets and clean streets, garbage cans on every corner and things like that, which again sounds really nice until you start moving into neighborhoods that do not have the backing up for that. And of course, we're going to get rid of all the homeless people so you don't feel icky when you look at them. Now, as I mentioned, this is the biggest large-scale test run of this kind of concept, and it was a big hit. This would influence city planning for generations to come. And we'll skip ahead just a little bit from here. We're going to bring in the next big thing that kind of drove urban renewal in the city of Chicago, which is the Great Migration. Roughly 1910 to 1970, we had thousands of people from the South move to the northern cities. Chicago in particular got somewhere around 20,000 people in like a single decade coming from the southern states to Chicago. So there's a lot of people moving up here. And while we were not an officially segregated city, we were pretty segregated because of things like redlining. Now, also, if you've never heard the term redlining before, it's literally when lenders and businesses look at a map of a city and they draw a red line across an area that they will not put money into for any reason. Can we guess why? Racism. Good job. You were listening. It's racism. So when you've got 20,000 new people on top of who was already here in just a couple of blocks, like Bronzeville, Englewood, all of the southern neighborhoods south of downtown and kind of curling around the west of downtown, all of those neighborhoods is where African Americans were kind of shoved to. There were even neighborhoods that passed local laws that said you couldn't rent or employ anybody who was Black, which is A, against the actual laws, and B, it forced a lot of people into very desperate situations. Now, just before the Great Migration really kind of kicks off, the 1909 plan for Chicago kind of pulls in many key components from the urban or the City Beautiful movement. And it would include things like civic centers, axial streets, that's, nice grid patterns, and green parklands. Skipping ahead. 1940s, 1930, yeah, 1940s. I kind of wrote this a little backwards. 1940s, post World War II, we have, and also post Great Depression, we saw a huge amount of urban decay. So what we're looking at here is areas around Bronzeville in the 1940s. So what we're seeing here is overcrowded tenements. We're seeing porches that are absolutely falling apart. We're seeing things kind of slapdash pushed together. And we're also seeing how close to downtown we are. Because those tall buildings right there is like less than 2 miles from where this is taken. And that's where our main economic trade hub is. So just, just a short walk or drive away from this beautiful downtown city center, you have this. And this is how people lived in these neighborhoods like Bronzeville for a very long time. And then in the wake of the New Deal, we have slum clearing, which becomes a popular movement for things like removing homelessness and things like that, which doesn't actually remove anything. It just moves it to the neighborhood next door. Because when you've got people who are already at a disadvantage and you don't give them anything to help them get out of that, you're just kind of kicking things from one side to another. Now, bouncing back just a little bit, 1930s to 1933, we have the Federation Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. They were created to regulate and legislate housing in the U.S. and the mortgage and loan industry. They initially were meant to make home buying easier and more accessible, but it ended up enshrining legalized prejudice and racism by creating redline to purposely withhold financial services from risky or blighted areas, aka poor Black communities. We also have an additional slew throughout the 1930s, 40s, and even into the 50s, several housing acts and mortgage laws that Congress passes. And not only are these aimed at helping certain types of home buyers, it's aimed at excluding certain types of home buyers. We have the reinforcement of you can't have these people in my neighborhood is basically what these were made for. You also had, even though things like veterans' rights and veterans' benefits were starting to kind of come in post World War II, and African American and Latino and indigenous peoples who fought in World War II, who were expecting to get these benefits, like easy access to home buying, were barred because of local laws that were passed, which were unconstitutional, but still kind of upheld through backdoor channels. 1934, we have the National Housing Act signed into law by FDR, which attempts to improve home buying. It's amended in the 1930s and again in the 40s. In 1949, the Housing Act by President Truman, which was aimed at removing slums, providing adequate public housing and low-income housing, expanding the role of lenders in home ownership and public housing construction. A lot of urban renewal and urban development or redevelopment was about trying to just house people. And this would turn into warehousing of people. And what starts out as very nice, comfortable, modern spaces that had modern amenities would very quickly fall into disrepair. So who's responsible for all this shit? U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. 1965, HUD is formed, created to help with rent affordability, homeownership, and public housing, etc. Notoriously, got some good big picture ideas on how we should move forward with things like public housing and rent affordability. Mixed reviews on implementation, because when you put people in the mix with preconceived notions and biases, it's all going to get fucked up. So they created Section 8 housing, federal housing grants, programs to help low-income families afford rent and eventually become homeowners. They also put a lot of the power into the hands of local authorities, which is not always a good idea. They also would have many investigations of fraud, mismanagement, corruption, institutionalized prejudices, and various other departments of developmental housing over the years. They really kind of stick their foot in it. They have not always had the best track record of carrying out these lofty, well-meaning ideas. Now, what are some of the strategies that they go for when doing urban redevelopment? So, economic revitalization, which is offering business incentives to do business in and also to take responsibility for infrastructure improvements in a depressed area, such as tax credits, abatements, investment opportunities, etc. A good example of this is when the University of Chicago kind of took the strong hand in guiding the redevelopment of the University of Chicago campus, Kenwood, Hyde Park, that area. They had a very personal investment and very heavy hand in how that neighborhood and neighborhoods were redesigned. Um, we also have slum clearing, removing large swaths of neighborhood that were deemed blighted. Often these are the poorest, most marginalized communities that have often been forgotten and spurred by the local government and lenders. And this is dressed up as an effort to improve things like public health and safety. And this also includes hostile architecture, which we will get to in a minute. I have a whole slide on that. But yeah, when they say that, oh yeah, there's so many potholes and all the streetlights don't work, so there's a lot of crime and we have cockroaches everywhere and this, that, the other thing, you literally made your own problem. That it seems to be the case for a lot of these neighborhoods, is that the city went, I don't care about you. And then suddenly we care about them because there's a developer coming in wanting to make some money. We also have eminent domain, which is both a good and a very over-abused tactic that the government will take. So if you've never heard of this, eminent domain is a law that allows the government to reclaim property to then repurpose for public use. So this is anytime like a dam is built and the land has to be acquired. That's acquired through eminent domain. Anytime that they want to build a large public park or they want to expand a highway, all of the land that has to be acquired is acquired through eminent domain. Sometimes they will give them a monetary, incentive to move. And then people who don't want to move will be forced out, sometimes without compensation. And it really depends on what color you are, and a lot of people get eminent domain is used primarily against African American, Latino, and indigenous groups. Very rarely is it actually used against white neighborhoods. In fact, a lot of projects are rerouted around poor white communities. Again, racism. So that brings me to hostile architecture, one of my least favorite things that is increasingly popular with governments and cities and increasingly unpopular with people who have to exist in public. Hostile architecture is an urban design strategy used to guide public behavior and exclude the public from accessing spaces in the public in an easy and or comfortable manner. So who does this hurt? Literally everyone. Has your ass ever hurt by sitting on a park bench? Yes. There you go. That's hostile architecture. But primarily, this hurts people who are elderly, disabled, people with young children, strollers, people who need to use strollers or wheelchairs, and most importantly, the homeless. So what are some of these things that this includes? Examples include benches with excessive armrests, such as the one on the far left there. We also have cut benches like the one on the bottom right there. By the way, if you want to know some bullshit, one of the reasons why cities will claim this is not actually hostile architecture is because they're like, oh, well, somebody can put a wheelchair there and they can sit with their buddies on that bench. Yeah, no, that's not happening, by the way. Curved benches, such as the stone one that you see just to the left of the cut bench and directly above it. Tiny, tiny seats that no one's ass is built for. Certainly not mine. things that have no seats, but they're just like a slightly curved board or ledge that you can lean on that is not meant to actually sit on, and so you can't rest on it for too long. Inaccessible or hard to access garbage cans, which you don't really think about that, but when's the last time you saw a garbage can on Michigan Avenue? Yeah. You know what? The last time I saw a garbage can on Michigan Avenue was the year before NASCAR came. NASCAR came and suddenly there's no more garbage cans on Michigan Avenue. I want to yell at the city about that because I miss garbage cans. Spikes and posts in doorways or on stoops or underpasses. These are places where people historically, even if it's just for one night, will hold up to literally just rest. And instead of putting money into things that will help, like affordable housing, homeless shelters, transitional housing, things like that, they're going to waste money on this stupid shit. Basically, anything that keeps a homeless person from resting in a dignified way can be described as hostile architecture. And what I think is interesting is that even though literally everyone hates it, there has never been a study done on the effects of hostile architecture and the public. And I can guess why. It's probably because the study will say it's ineffectual, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of time, and you should stop doing it. But that's not going to be very nice for cities to have to hear, that they're going to have to find a real reason to help people. All right. So now that we got the foundation of what goes into urban revitalization and urban development, what are some examples in Chicago where we've seen this happen? Well, oh, sorry, I skipped a bit. Intentions and outcomes. Sorry, I was writing this with my 6-month-old on my lap, so... Intents and outcomes. Intentions to improve the living conditions, upgrade amenities and infrastructure, reduce urban sprawl, improve economic opportunities. A lot of the outcomes is price pushing out of existing communities, fracturing existing communities, and driving up the cost of living through gentrification. When private developers are left in charge, the focus inevitably shifts to corporate profitability and not sustainability, community, or private citizens. And neighborhoods may look pretty, but they will inevitably suffer in ways that will be felt for generations. How many of you have been through a neighborhood that it looks like this? Yeah, I actually grew up in a neighborhood that now looks like this. So this is a good example of gentrification, which comes along with urban development. And if there's any private developers in the crowd, first of all, a hearty fuck you. Second of all, I need you to start hiring artists again. Thank you. Thank you. I'm still fun. All right, so what are some examples in Chicago? So Little Hell, which is a great name. Little Hell, located alongside the Chicago River in the 1850s. Opa. Located along the side of the Chicago River in the 1850s and was originally poor Irish and Swedish immigrants. It was called Little Hell because there were gas refineries all along that stretch of the neighborhood. And when you have a gas refinery, you have all these little smokestacks that have little flames that shoot out the top. It's very fun. Sets off a lot of nasty, noxious gases, fumes, but they don't care because they're poor immigrants. Nobody cares about these poor immigrants. So, and back in the day, there was no EPA that Trump could dismantle to, fix things here. In case you didn't know where I stand. So this slum would be cleared in the late 19th century in what was known as a civic beautification campaign that was aimed at trying to improve society morally through the process of slum clearing. Now, one of the big things that came with the City Beautiful movement was this idea that people who are poor got to be there not because of hard times or you lost a job or your shitty uncle lost the family fortune or things like that, things that may be beyond your control. People thought that poverty was a choice, that you chose to wake up one day and become a part of a community that is often overlooked and deeply taken advantage of. And so the thought was with stuff like this, that if you came in and you got rid of all the ugly buildings and you cleaned the streets once in a while, that people would clean up their own act and they would care more about the streets that they live on, even though they don't have jobs and adequate housing. It doesn't actually fix any of the problems that they had. All it did was displace these people and move them to other neighborhoods in Chicago. Now, Chicago's always been an immigrant neighborhood. It's always been an immigrant community. So these people did find other places to be, but it did break up existing communities that were already here. And they had to rebuild those communities. Now, this is not something that's new. It's been around literally as old as time, but this is what happened to Little Hell. Another example is Robert Taylor Homes. This was the largest public housing project in the country. This is a massive, massive project. And I honestly didn't know a ton about the Robert Taylor Homes until I started looking into this thing. By the way, I didn't know jack shit about this until I started looking into it. And if you're mad, just think about how I am, because I have literally 200 pages of notes that didn't make it into this thing. And all of them are angry. So Robert Taylor Homes is located in Bronzeville, predominantly a Black neighborhood south of downtown. This is one of those neighborhoods that saw a huge influx of Black residents from the Great Migration. Over the course of the 60 years that we count as the Great Migration, Chicago received 80,000 people. Now, named after an African-American housing advocate and banker, the Chicago Housing Authority board member, Robert Taylor. Now, he also resigned in 1950 when the Chicago Housing Authority refused to consider integrated public housing. So they named it after a building, or a series of buildings, that they did not intend on integrating, which I think is a huge slap in the face to this man. Now, this was opened in 1962 as the largest public housing project in the United States, with 28 buildings stretching across 2 miles of Bronzeville in one straight line. So that's what this picture is. It's the straight line of the Robert Taylor Homes. And as you can see, the buildings are generally grouped in this little horseshoe shape of 3 buildings, on a block, and then a block down, you've got another 3 buildings. And then there's a couple that's just 1 building, or 2 just facing each other. But generally, it's the horseshoe shape that they had. Now, each one is 16 stories tall, and they all contained a total of 4,145 units. This was meant to house 11,000 people, which sounds like a lot of people, and you'd be correct. But at its peak, it would end up, the whole project, 2 miles worth of people, 27,000 people. This was not built to hold 27,000 people. And so you can probably guess how quickly this declined. 96% of the people who lived here were African American, and by design by the people who built these spaces, this was to contain African American citizens to the south side of Chicago. They figured if we make these giant warehouses for them to live in, they're not going to come into our neighborhoods. This was also part of redlining, where they're like, well, we just built them a shit ton of houses. Why do they need to come over here? And this is happening in 1962 when this opens. Now, originally, these were actually pretty nice houses to live in for 1962. It had elevators. Each building had elevators, which was a very new thing. They all had modern appliances. They all had, pretty spacious apartments for public housing. But inevitably, when you basically build a cage for people to live in and you go, good luck, it's gonna fall into disrepair pretty quickly. The Chicago Housing Authority basically left them to their own devices at this point. So anytime there was a broken window, they're like, that sounds like a you problem. Anytime that there was a pest control problem, they'd be like, maybe you should just get some Raid next time you go grocery shopping. They didn't actually give a shit about these people. Also, if you're wondering why it's so hard to combat pests in large buildings like this, it's because they will not treat the whole building. They will only treat the complaining apartment. So it just moves from one apartment to the other, which is also why they didn't care about doing pest control in these spaces, because, again, 2 miles worth of buildings and 27,000 people, they're like, that sounds expensive, and that's a you problem. So you had the Chicago Housing Authority deciding that these people were not worth investing in. And so the buildings would very quickly go into disrepair. And also, when you have warehouses full of people and businesses that do not want to put shops or businesses in that area, and you have no economic opportunity, what comes next? Crime. So Robert Taylor Holmes was notorious for having a ton of crime, varying in, across, simple assaults and muggings and things like that, all the way up to straight up murder. Like there was a case of a little girl being thrown out of one of the windows here. And her killer was never caught, by the way, because the cops didn't give a shit. So that's what happens when you disincentivize and devalue large spaces like this. And you're probably wondering why I'm talking about it, because it doesn't seem like this is urban revitalization, right? So 1993, the Chicago Housing Authority finally is like, bad luck for us. So they decide they are going to demolish these buildings and move people to mixed income housing with the U.S. HUD federal grants that they had gotten through the Hope 4 program. Now, without getting too into it, because it's a really long thing, the Hope 4 program was basically set up by HUD in order to give municipalities large grants of money to fix their shit. And they were, as small as maybe a couple $1,000,000 or as large as billions of dollars. Chicago actually had the largest amount of grants ever in the United States from HUD, which is insane, by the way. So in 2005, the relocation is considered complete. So from 1993 to 2005, they are moving people out of these spaces. And by moving, I mean they gave them eviction notices, and a lot of them were told, best of luck, because they were not replacing 27,000 people's worth of homes. They were replacing 11,000 people's worth of homes because they were going by units. And a lot of them were not high-rise buildings like this. A lot of them were like low-rise apartments, maybe 3 or 4 stories tall, very small amounts of units, and mixed income, meaning that not everybody who lived in these buildings could move into the new spaces, because some of those units were meant for people who did not need public assistance. So you have created much less housing than there is needed. So this also caused community displacement, and it caused all kinds of other problems, but mainly a major housing problem and community displacement. 2007, the last of the buildings is demolished, and it's considered a success by people who like this kind of thing. Lee Bay, on the other hand, who is an architectural critic for the Chicago Sun-Times, says, what made them a failure wasn't purely design. What made them a failure is building them that way and then treating them the same way the city treats the slums they replaced. You starve it out of city resources, of economic opportunity, all those things. The same thing happens to the new housing that happened to the old. And this is a story that is told time and time and time again. Every time a city gets the wild hair up their ass that they're going to fix the slums, they don't actually fix it, because none of the problems that caused it in the first place are addressed, such as forcing lenders to put businesses in places so people have jobs, keeping schools open so people have an incentive to raise their families there, allowing public libraries to remain open by giving them funding, fixing the goddamn potholes so people don't break their car every time they drive down the street, things like that. Yeah? None of these get addressed after the revitalization project is finished. It all just kind of goes back to shit again. Now, this whole stretch, 2 miles worth of apartments, was replaced with approximately 2,300 low-rise homes and apartments and 7 new renovated community spaces. So how many did I tell you? 27,000 people in 2,300 low-rise units. The math ain't mathin', and I'm shit at math, and I know that that's not mathing. The total cost of this project, by the way, was $583 million. Most of the people who lived in these communities did not receive new housing or assistance because they rewrote how assistance should be given, and then they were deemed undeserving of federal or public housing funds, which is some bullshit. Crime also would just move to different spaces because, yeah, now that we have these mixed income housing, and we have a little bit more of a cop presence, and so we have and we also have people here who actually care about whether or not cops respond to things. um, Crime just moves over to the next neighborhood where they have an easier time. We also have the city still ignoring those ongoing issues and quietly allowing these spaces to fall into disrepair again. You angry yet? You angry? Because I am too. Another good example of revitalization and urban development is the Henry Horner homes, which I don't remember the book, but there was a book I had to read in grade school about a set of brothers that lived in the Henry Horner homes. Did anyone else have to read that book? Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So I had to read that book. It was set in the Henry Horner homes community. It's kind of it's a weird, sad, happy book. But anyway, so this is another infamous Chicago Housing Authority project on the near west side, and it's non-contiguous. So it's not like the Robert Taylor homes where everything's in a nice straight line. This is kind of a scattered community with collections of buildings throughout a neighborhood. Constructed between 1957 and 1963, and named after Illinois' first Jewish mayor, or sorry, Jewish governor, which was pretty cool. 920 units across 10 high-rise and a handful of low-rise buildings. There was an extension added in 1961, bringing the total to 16 buildings and 1,656 units. And just like everything else, we see the same issues. We see the Chicago Housing Authority saying, best of luck once the buildings are completed, mismanagement, neglect. We see the city deprioritizing these spaces because, well, they're just a bunch of poor people and they're not white people, so we don't give a shit. They're not going to care much, right? Wrong, they do care. But the city goes, they're not worth our time. You have businesses that are struggling when they're there, and businesses who go, it's not worth building there, so there's few economic opportunities. You have very few schools, you have very few libraries, you have very few actual community resources in this space. You have increased police presence that's not actually helpful because it's all about harassment and not actual law enforcement. So all of these things continue to drive the Henry Horner homes in the decline of this actual neighborhood. By the 1970s, crime and poverty went up and buildings start to decline. In 1987, the federal government actually seizes this collection of homes from the Chicago Housing Authority because they're like, bitch, you can't handle this. Like, they're like, you clearly don't have your shit together. So we have in 1991, the Mothers Guild. So after the Housing Authority has taken over these spaces, and they're also not doing much with it, the Mothers Guild comes together. The Mothers Guild was a collection of mothers who lived in the Henry Horner community, and they were tired of their children being snapped up into gangs, being killed in the streets, being harassed by police, not given the same opportunities that any other child anywhere else in the city were getting. And they were also pissed that their homes were literally falling apart beneath them. So they got together and they started yelling at the city, and they were like, bitch, do your job. Start taking care of these spaces because people want to build community. They want to take care of these spaces, and you're not helping. So they get together and they actually sue the Chicago Housing Authority for neglect, mismanagement, and public health and safety dangers such as pest control. They also did this by bringing receipts. They literally walked around the neighborhood with cameras and they filmed what was happening in the neighborhood, and they documented with photos as well. They also did interviews with people who lived in the neighborhood, and they also brought receipts for like how the Chicago Housing Authority was not doing their job, by how many complaints were given that were ignored, how many requests for just even basic maintenance were ignored. And they did a pretty good job, all things considered. So the homes get slated for this plan for transformation, and it gets turned into West Haven. So the Henry Horner homes get demolished. 461 new housing units get built, completed in 2001. Now, at the height, again, this is thousands of people who live across these buildings, and they're not going to fit in all these spaces. And again, a lot of these spaces are mixed income housing. So about half the people who lived in these spaces did not get a spot in the new spaces. So you're, again, displacing all of these communities. And what you think might be good about income housing, like, oh yeah, the people on public assistance get the same spaces as people who rent. And you think, okay, cool, you're bridging an economic divide. It's going to be very obvious when people move in and they don't have the same resources as their neighbor. And so the same biases that people are going to walk into the building with are going to persist and cause problems within those neighborhoods. So yeah, no, it's a big fucking problem. 1995 demo begins and it goes on until 2008. But the last of the buildings that really were meaningfully built were in 2001. And we still see people who were displaced from this community. Now, we also have this piece of shit. University of Illinois Urbana absolutely wrecked Little Italy, Greektown, and Maxwell streets. So if you look at the right side of the screen, you've got Little Italy, you've got Maxwell Street, and Greektown. These were really vibrant, happy, economically important neighborhoods. Because these were actually some of the first neighborhoods to really develop in Chicago, they had long-standing roots here, and they had very active, involved, vibrant communities, and many of the people who worked in Little Italy in particular had government jobs. And so when you've got neighborhoods that actually do shit, their buildings are just a little ticky-tacky. We just need a little TLC, fresh coat of paint, maybe some tuck pointing in there. And that's all they really wanted when they heard urban revitalization was coming. They actually wanted a little development. They wanted a little TLC from the government. And so they welcomed it at first. And then they heard this shit was coming and they were like, oh, no. So what happens here? So the building of the Urbana campus here in Chicago is steamrolled through this community, largely Italian, Greek, and Jewish immigrants. In the 1950s, this neighborhood, or these collections of neighborhoods, were listed as blighted and slated for urban renewal. These were still very tight-knit communities. And we also had a growing Black and Latino presence because as we're coming into the 1950s and 1960s, we start seeing people who just literally could not live in these tiny confined spaces in places like Bronzeville and like the Henry Horner Homes area, moving into some of the immigrant communities that surrounded that area. We have lots of mom and pop shops, lots of import shops. We have lots of small, thriving businesses that were keystone businesses, butcher shops, tailors, bakeries, all, Greektown had a dozen or so import stores purely for religious iconography. Because if you've ever met a Greek Orthodox person, you know what I'm talking about. Lots of iconography in their houses. So they have these wonderful businesses and people talk to each other all the time, and they see that everything just needs a little fresh coat of paint. We have Maxwell Street was a bustling outdoor market, which now we only have Maxwell Street Days, which happens one day a month in the summer. Maxwell Street Days looked like that color photo every day. You guys have seen the Blues Brothers? Of course you have. Maxwell Street was that 24/7, 365. Lots of people out in the street doing what they do. And now we've got the campus and nothing resembling what that is. So Richard Daley Sr. really wanted a college campus. Not just like what we have with like Columbia College or the School of Chicago Art Institute, like these high-rise buildings. He wanted a prestigious college to build a campus in Chicago. This was part of his overall arcing plan to revitalize Chicago. Admittedly, he had a bit of a problem in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s because white flight had moved all the money out to the suburbs. And so the downtown area and a lot of the surrounding neighborhoods really were struggling because there just weren't enough people willing to work jobs. There weren't enough jobs to support everybody, and things were kind of falling apart. You had buildings that were built in, the 1840s, well, not 40s, 1871, we had that big fire. So 1871 and onward, you've got these big buildings that need help, generally have good bones, they just need some work. And he's like, nah, useless, tear it down, build a parking structure. He's trying to get people back to downtown Chicago. And so he thinks that having a campus near to downtown is going to help with that. So what he does is he sees this vibrant community and he goes, perfect, perfect spot. Not only was demolition already beginning because, again, these people had welcomed the removal of some of the more, dilapidated buildings in the promise of having new housing and businesses being built. But now that it's slated for demo and there's some clearance, he doesn't have to fight for that space. He can convince developers to give up that space. And also, it's a perfect buffer zone between all those blighted and undesirable neighborhoods full of non-white people. The campus here is a buffer zone from what he considered to be gang-ridden, disgusting neighborhoods and the pristine downtown he was trying to make. And that's why he built it there. He thought it was a great spot. And of course, everybody who had supported him, who worked in his, regime in Chicago, felt betrayed. They voted him in and they're like, you're throwing away Nona's house. You're throwing away our businesses. You're breaking up our communities. And for what? A disgusting brutalist campus? Fuck that. Fuck brutalism. At least, listen, I could go all day about brutalism and how much it sucks. I want Art Deco back. If he had built Art Deco, I could have forgiven it a little bit. So, not only does he build this campus, which disrupts an already disrupted community, he approves the expansion of the I-55 or the Eisenhower Expressway. And this cuts right through Little Italy, Greektown, Maxwell Street, and Chinatown. Our Chinatown is so small, in fact, because of the highway expansions. It literally blocked them in and they couldn't expand beyond that. So if you're wondering why we only have like 8 blocks of Chinatown, now you know why. So this causes a massive public outcry. And he said that it was the best bang for his buck. He thought this was the most reasonable space to do it because he couldn't negotiate well with the railroads to give up their space. So yeah. It always comes back to the railroads here. He thought this was ideal. It was a reasonable price. And even though his constituents were pissed, he was like, you're just a bunch of whiners. And he completely ignored them. 1965, the campus opens, continues to displace people. And those people who were displaced had to integrate into nearby communities. There was a huge loss of the ethnic, unique businesses and flair that these spaces came from. And I'm gonna say it again, it's an ugly fucking campus. I cannot overstate how much I hate brutalism. Coming to our final example, Cabrini Green. Probably the most infamous example in Chicago, despite it only being, I think, the second largest project in the city of Chicago. It is located near the near north side, constructed between the 1940s and 1960s, over about 20 years. And there are 10 sections involved in Cabrini Green. Now, it's named after St. Frances Cabrini, who was a missionary and poverty activist. She was a Catholic nun. And also William Green, who was an American Labor Union president and a social reformer. The Francis Row houses are named after Frances Cabrini, and then the Green Tower house, the tall buildings, those are named after William Green. This borders 2 very wealthy neighborhoods. On one side, you've got Gold Coast. On the other side, you have Lincoln Park. And this is also less than a mile from downtown. Fantastic location. And so you have this neighborhood right in between a bunch of really wealthy spaces, very close to the economic center. And they decide they're going to use it to warehouse people and forget about them, because that's basically what happens here. We have, in total, 23 high-rise towers with 3,000 units that were built and an additional 586 row houses. At its peak, over 15,000 people lived here. And originally, it was primarily white and Italian immigrants who lived here, hence the Cabrini part of Cabrini Green. But by the 1960s, the majority of residents are African-American people. And again, much like the Henry Horner homes, the Robert Taylor homes, these were modern amenity spaces. They were really beautiful. They were full of, your usual appliances. They were well lit, well maintained. But you then have an economic decline. In Cabrini Green's case, there were factories in the area that had a lot of business during the Great Depression and World War II years. But post World War II, those factories close. And suddenly you have a community that was primarily employed become primarily unemployed. And then because we have, again, African American people living here, and we love redlining in this city apparently, you have a lack of economic opportunities. So this increases the economic divides between the public housing neighborhood and the other surrounding neighborhoods. You have a deprioritization and deinvestment of the neighborhood, leading to, rapid urban decay and a rapid rise in crime. You have Chicago Housing Authority mismanagement and neglect, leading to disrepair. And then all of this leads to this sort of like tinderbox of violence and crime. And you also have overpopulation, because these homes were not meant to house 15,000 people. They were meant to house about 9,000 or so people. So you have almost double what it was meant to hold there. So of course, when you have that many people in a space where there's no good opportunities, it's just not a good idea, and it's not going to be a good time for anybody. And if you're wondering what those are, the top picture there, that's the Cabrini row houses, and then down below is one of the green high rises. So most of the buildings, this is one of the downfalls of this building, or this type of building here. Most of the buildings lacked interior hallways. And you're like, all right, why does that matter? Have you had winter here in Chicago? Yeah, it's cold, it's icy, we get rain and snow in the same day. So you have these exterior hallways. But that also makes it very easy to literally block off sections of the buildings, which a lot of the gangs who operated here took full advantage of. And then you also have massive exposure to the front entryways and the front rooms of these apartments, because if the doors and the windows aren't sealed correctly, all of that water and cold air gets right up in there and causes rapid decay. You have broken elevators and doors and windows and fencing and streetlights and all of that other stuff. Very, very common. And of course, like all the other developments, Chicago Housing Authority drags their feet on fixing things, and it often went unfixed. We have lots of pests such as rats and roaches. They are also allowed to thrive because there's little to no pest control. And as we mentioned earlier, a lot of apartments don't like to do pest control anyway because it's expensive to hit the whole building instead of just 1 or 2 units. You also have utilities like water and electricity are unreliable because the grid there, like the actual infrastructure grid, was unreliable. You also had problems with people turning things off purposely and destroying things purposely because it would benefit them in one way or another. And then you had police who didn't give a shit if they didn't have running water in these houses. Cops who didn't give a shit if there was no heat in your building in winter. So things were just kind of left to do as they please. The police presence and harassment was extremely high, as was the gang presence high there. But along with all of that, you had this larger undertone of a very tight-knit community. People who did not have a lot, who helped each other. People who had very deep roots, who lived here for, 2, maybe 3 generations, who knew this city very well, who knew this neighborhood very well, who knew every single person who lived in their building. And they all wanted renovation, not demolition. They felt like this had good ideals, good bones, and that it just needed a little TLC. It just needed a little redirection and a little economic help. Now, that doesn't happen. 1995 to 1996, the Chicago Housing Authority is absorbed by HUD, and the plan for demolition and revitalization is announced. The plan for demo for about 18,000 units as part of a national change to public housing. So this is not just Cabrini Green, this is a couple of different housing units. 1999 to 2011, demolition and rebuilding takes place over the course of this 11 years as a plan for transformation. So this was also part of the Henry Horner homes as well. This was done to the tune of $1.5 billion from the Hope for Grants and Housing and Community Developments. Lawsuits start immediately within a couple years of this coming up. People are angry because just like Robert Taylor homes and just like Henry Horner homes, they are not replacing it with sufficient housing. There are more people than there are units. And they're also, again, moving to mixed income housing. So not everybody who lived in these spaces was guaranteed a spot in the new housing. And so immediately people who are like, what do you mean I don't get a house? What do you mean I don't get a new space to live? What am I supposed to do? And the housing authority is like, that's a you problem. So they take them to court. And some people win their lawsuits. Most of them don't. The high rises are demolished, as were many of the row houses, but some of them remain. Some are still around today. They're very dilapidated, would not recommend urban exploring in there. The community, as I mentioned, largely wanted renovation to these spaces because they felt like things could be fixed. They feared also the loss of their community that they had held onto for decades, the familiarity of their neighborhoods, and falling through the cracks, as many did when the new housing came in. And again, not only did they want renovation, they wanted people to come in and do business in their neighborhood. So that way they would have some fucking jobs. So that way they could have a little bit of dignity in their spaces, right? And while there were residents who were able to move, most of them did not receive adequate help to leave. And so this caused massive displacement and community upheaval. There are still people who are pissed off about this. And I hope you guys are too. So what do we do? What is the solution here? I want to stress that I am not an economic planner. I don't know shit about math. I am not an urban planner. I am a person with access to the internet and a lot of opinions. So this is what I think we should be doing, just based on what I know and what I've seen actually helps communities. First and foremost is to stabilize the rent and stop corporate ownership of homes. It's like number one on my list. This would stop the massive rise in cost for housing, and it would basically stabilize things so people actually have a chance to kind of catch up to where the actual cost of living is. The next thing is listen to the community. The people who live in these spaces know better than you what they want and need. They do not need some CEO with an endless pocketbook telling them what they need and want. They also don't need a luxury apartment. I'm going to say that luxury apartments are not something we need. Affordable housing is what we need. So directly address their concerns and their needs. Do schools need to be replaced? Is there a new community center that we need? Do we need a new police station? Do we need streetlights fixed? Ask them what they need. They'll tell you. Bring in more community resources to give people an actual sense of community. Encourage people to get out of their houses and off the internet and go touch some grass. And allow residents to take a larger role in the revitalization, which would stop the gentrification. Because when you have people who are part of these communities, they want to keep that flair. They want to keep that vibe. They don't need, the next apothecary pottery barn garbage that you're going to bring in, right? You don't need that. The next thing is force lenders to diversify their pool of recipients and allow for short-term loans and business loans. Because what this is going to do is it's going to, address community concerns about what kind of businesses are needed in that community, but it's also going to allow for the growth of ma and pa shops, a small business, which historically has been the backbone of communities, of cities. It's not Taco Bell, it's not Target, it's not Walmart that drive us. It's, the ma and pa shops. You don't remember going to Walmart, but you remember going to that little shop owned by the nice Italian ladies. You remember going to the diner run by, a fresh immigrant off the boat. You remember that stuff. You don't remember going to fucking Walmart. I hate Walmart too. So this also stops gentrification, and by also bringing in the ability to own a home, to the ability to dignified rent, you also allow for less crime, because a lot of crime is poverty driven. It's desperation driven. So when you remove barriers like this, you're going to naturally bring the crime down. And this is just good advice for anybody. Tax and eat the rich. I can spend their money better. Ask me how. And then force municipal authorities to distribute funds and attention equitably. This is not equally, because equally does not mean that things are going to get done, because you can arbitrarily set what is an equal, measure. Equitably means this neighborhood's doing just fine and we don't need to do anything to it. They've got their shit handled. But this neighborhood over here needs a lot of work. So let's put our attention on that and listen to the community and have them tell us what they need, because they know better than we do. So things like fixing the potholes, streetlights, things like that. Forcing the city to do its goddamn job. So this is what I propose we do to help kind of fix a lot of the problems that urban revitalization and urban development have caused. So thank you so much for coming. The floor is open for questions. Please do make sure to give all your money to Chicago for Chicagoans and for me, because I do have a Patreon.